Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Recovery Podcast. I'm Matt, and on today's episode, we'll be diving into part 2 of our 2-part series with my wife, Natalie. We'll discuss what marriage was like with her working recovery when I wasn't, what it was like when I got sober, and the challenges we weren't expecting as we entered into a new chapter of our life with us both working a program. If you love somebody in addiction or who is working a program, this episode's for you. On the flip side, if you're an addict who is still new in recovery, this episode is also for you. I can speak for both Natalie and myself when I say that just because the addict in a relationship finds sobriety doesn't mean the work ends there. We hope you find hope and encouragement as we share those experiences with you in this episode. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and I am joined once again by my beautiful wife, Natalie. Say hi, Nat.
Hey, guys.
Wow. You don't have to sound so excited to be here. Natalie is very tired. She's been being mom of the year. She was up with the kids and got them going. We had softball games and running around. And she let me sleep in because she loves me. But that said, she's also tired. So I'm sorry, babe. I love you. But she's still here because we both know that what's being said and what we're talking about this week is important. And we're just gonna basically kind of jump right back in and do part 2 of the conversation that we started last week. And I'll recap that after I do my housekeeping. And just say that, once again, like we always start the podcast, we definitely do encourage anybody on the podcast to share from their experiences with whatever recovery program or fellowship that they're a part of. But nobody is a spokesperson or representative of said recovery program. We're all fallible. We can all go back out. And just because somebody who might be on this podcast may go out and use again does not mean that the program doesn't work. Means that we didn't work the program or there was something, there's not a person on this podcast who hasn't had a relapse as they've engaged with recovery. And we can all tell you from experience that there were compromises and there were things that we've done that lead you down that path. So these programs work, whether it be AA, NA, CR, it doesn't matter. All of them have something valuable and can lead you to not just being sober, but addressing the issue underneath, which is exactly what this podcast is about. We just wanted to create a space that anybody from any fellowship could share their experiences from. So, also, if you would like to continue supporting the podcast, whatever platform you listen to it on, whether it be YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, or you just follow the direct MP3 link from Facebook, wherever you see or whatever methods of engagement that those platforms have, whether it be sharing or liking, commenting, subscribing, commenting and liking and subscribing are the biggest ones. They don't cost you anything. The podcast is completely free. But if it's something that you would like to take that little extra step to help support the podcast and get the word out, those things are absolutely massive. So I always say that. And then I also flip the other side of the coin and want to make sure that, like I say, that if you listen to this podcast, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It feels like Natalie and I were praying before this, and I was just being grateful because to God about how when I started out with the podcast, I said, if there's one person that hears this that needs to hear it, it'll have been worth it. And it seems like every week, at least one person or multiple people will come up to me and share their experiences and what they've gotten out of, so-and-so said this and it really resonated with me, or I'm really glad that you're talking about this because I felt alone. And I think the subject matter of Natalie's Natalie's episode from last week, I should say, was really important. And this week we're going to kind of focus on our marriage and what recovery has looked like for us and what our marriages looked like pre and post recovery. So we're going to dive into that. Again, things that I think need to be talked about, that issues that I think I kind of see that a lot of people feel alone in. They feel isolated. And I kind of made a Facebook post when I on my personal page sharing the episode, and I said, especially with things like sexual trauma, it has a very unique insidiousness to it, because not only does it cause immense emotional and sometimes physical harm and mental harm, but it also almost always carries with it this incredibly heavy shame to it that makes and tells you that you're not only are you dirty, not only or are you worthless or you're used or you're damaged goods, but you're also unsalvageable. And that is just 1000% not true. And I think if you got anything out of Natalie's episode from last week, I think that's what stands out. So all that said, to kind of recap last week, do you want to give us like a kind of a, if you can, like a short recap of what we talked about last week?
Yeah. So we talked about um, basic childhood, growing up in a quote unquote normal family. Mom and dad still married. And then when my life kind of got tipped upside down in college, where um, about 2 to 3 weeks into college, I was raped, and then about 2 months later, fell into an abusive relationship, and the damage that had, that I carried for so long, um, and the freedom that I found through Christ.
Mm-hmm. And a couple of the things we talked about, obviously, if you've listened to this podcast, you know that Natalie and I are a part of Celebrate Recovery, and and I know a lot of you guys are as well. And um, but not only did well, both of us, but specifically Natalie, find a lot of freedom in Celebrate Recovery, but also through Beauty for Ashes,
Mhm.
which I just realized I completely forgot to link anything about that, but I will on this episode. So sorry about that, guys. But again, if you would like to reach out, please email the podcast, or if you know Natalie and I, go to Natalie,
Mhm.
and if you're more comfortable talking with her. Um, and as Natalie stated, in that abusive relationship she was in, there was also more sexual assault and physical assault. Um, and I listened back to it this week while I was working, and I was just blown away by your vulnerability with it, because I know it was hard, and I know it. Even though you've worked through it, there's it doesn't feel good to relive those things. So
Right.
I really appreciate you doing that. And I know there are other people out there that appreciate your vulnerability and willingness to do this. But we kind of left off last week talking about mainly the what our experiences were doing Beauty for Ashes, and you've done it 7 times now,
Mhm.
and then one of, I forget, was it the last time you did it
Yep.
that we had the portion for spouses, men that are married to people who have had sexual trauma, and I was sharing how beneficial that was, and our experiences in our marriage, and our sex life, and our intimacy, and how that kind of changed, and where I was with that and where you were, and how those experiences were different, and the in working through it, and doing that in love really has not only healed a lot of those things, but it had kind of exposed us to this new level of intimacy that I don't think either one of us anticipated.
Right.
It's tough to imagine something that you're so hindered with from past trauma all of a sudden becoming something that you find so much joy in. So I'm a huge proponent for Beauty for Ashes. I think it's such a good program, and you know, if that's something that you can't access, there are other. I know there have got to be other resources out there, and you can always work on this as well in your recovery program, which I know you've done.
Mhm.
And so on that topic, as we're married, and now you're well, I'll kind of set it up. So, kind of, I want to bring. I'm sure that your past and your sexual trauma will come back up again, but I kind of wanted to take this episode to talk about what married life is like when you've got two people in recovery. And um, our marriage was both been defined by addiction and now is defined by recovery.
Hmm.
And so I know, so to kind of set this up, Natalie and I got married in 2013, and was it that same year
Yeah, so we got married June 1st, and in September of that year,
I overdosed?
you
So
overdosed.
I had never really been exposed to really even like drinking too much. Like I kind of dabbled in a little bit, but it was always pretty tame and pretty controlled. And
More social.
yeah, and kind of I think I had smoked weed like maybe 3 or 4 times, like never done anything too crazy. And I think when we got married, I was carrying so much weight of trying to put on this facade that I had it all together. I wanted to show my family that I had overcome all of the trauma from my childhood, and that I was hey guys, like all of your hard work paid off. Like look at me now. I'm married. I've got a career. You know, I'm on my own. You know, I'm self-sufficient. I'm doing well. And in the meantime, my depression was just driving me lower and lower and lower. It just became so heavy, and the weight of this kind of false sense of self I was carrying around, and this depression that was growing, and all of these changes that were happening in my life. I remember one time I had kind of it was like one of the first couple times I had really drank by myself, and I was like a six pack in. And I remember walking through our apartment at the time and seeing that these, like I think it was Vicodin or something like that, and being inebriated, I was like, yeah, why not? And so I tried it, and I was like, that was fun. And then from there, it turned into a month long bender of anything I could get my hands on until I finally wound up in the hospital, overdosed. And while that was a traumatic experience for me, almost dying, and the shame that came with that, there was also this very bastardized version of a spiritual awakening for me, where I realized that like oh, this is who I am. Like Daniel and I talked about this in his podcast, or his episode of the podcast, where the first time you really try something that offers you relief, it's like a whole new world opens up for you. And um you kind of in this weird way come to terms with who you are really on the inside, like your dysfunction and everything. Like you kind of embrace it because it offers you relief in that moment. And then from there you end up just kind of chasing that dragon for the rest of your using career until you either just come to a point where you give it up, or and you surrender, or you die. And I'm very fortunate that I didn't. But are you comfortable with talking about what that experience was like for you? I know it was pretty traumatic, but I
Yeah,
do.
I mean, I think it's important. So I was so young. We were both so young, and I think that I had this false idea of what life was like being married. Um, I bought into the fairy tale experience, and I think that we were just trying to figure it out. And I remember when that happened, someone asked me, "How did you not know?" And those words stuck with me for a while, because it's right. Like, how can you live with somebody and not even know that this is going on? Um, and I really didn't know how to answer that. I mean, I still don't really know, other than the fact that um, God wasn't going to give me more than I could handle. Um, and so I remember that night I was actually having dinner with my parents at a Charlie's. At this time we were living in Norwood. Um, And I was working at Family Christian up in Mason. So it was about, 15, 20-minute drive.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just going to stay because I had opened. So I was like, I'm just going to stay up at my parents' house, and it was late. But something told me throughout dinner, like, you need to just go home. And I'm like, this is weird. And I was like, whatever, I'm going to go with it because I can't shake it. So I'm like, all right, guys, I'm going to go home. And I tried to call you. I think it was like 72 times in between Field Turtle and Norwood, and you weren't answering, and I was starting to panic. I remember walking in the house and you were on the bed, and God just works. Like, the whole thing, you just, when I take a step back, I'm like, there is no doubt that God had this from start to finish. So we were, that year, we had switched out housemates. So we lived in a duplex. And one of our friends from college ministry actually had moved in, him and his wife and his little boy. So another God thing, right? That somebody was there that we knew. I remember walking in and I screamed, and Will, I'm trying to describe Will.
Will is a slight framed fella. He's not a big guy by any means, and he's not like I don't want to like.
He's not like a Paul Bunyan. Like
like Paul, like Will. One still to this day, somebody that I really haven't, since life has kind of taken us different directions, but I've always loved Will. He's kind of a lot of things that I am not. So he's more reserved, and he's very calm and very intentional about the things he does and says. And I kind of am not like that all the time. And so, and I'm also 6'5", and he's like, I don't want to say the wrong in case he hears it, and he's like, man, I'm not 5'8" or whatever, but he's not like he's not a big dude. And
so when I say this next part, just envision like the opposite of Matt. So if you've ever seen Matt, it's not. So I come in, I scream because he's non-responsive. He's on the bed, and Will comes busting through the door of the duplex. I mean, breaks down the door to call 911, and he's trying to call 911. The world is spinning and I'm standing still. I just feel like I have no idea what's going on. I'm in a twilight. So he comes in, he's like, it's okay. He calls 911. Squad gets there. Police officers show up. One officer is like, ma'am, those are your prescription pills. Are you giving these? Are you supplying him these? And I was like, no. I was just in such shock. And the guy was like, well, I should charge you. And another guy was like, I'm going to take her over here. And he took me into the living room. Mind you, this apartment's 500 square foot. Like, it is not big at all. The cop comes over and he's like, you know what? I'll take care of him. You've got so much to worry about. Like, I've got this, and God's going to take care of it. Okay. I mean, I'm newly married and my husband is non-responsive on the bed. So they load you in this, they're getting ready. They're working on you. I'm trying to call people. I called my dad. And then I called your aunt. And I just remember not being able to get the words out. And she goes, Natalie, shut up. I can't hear you. And I was like, ha. And then I let it out. And then as soon as I did, I just fell to the ground on the porch. And one of the paramedics ended up helping me into the squad. And then we went to just an emergency department. It wasn't even a full hospital at the time. And I just remember it was go, go, go. And then there was this stillness, and it was like the reality sunk in of holy cow. And doctor after doctor coming in and being like, you're lucky that your husband's still here. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And it was just so overwhelming. And I didn't even have time to process. I remember the only thing that I was super concerned about was there was a doctor who's a total jerk. And he kept trying to get you to wake up. And so he was punching your chest and smacking your face. And the whole time I'm like, dude, if one of these sticks and he wakes up, like, we're in trouble. And then just, the questions of like, how did you not know? Did you not go through his phone? Did you not see the signs? And it's, no, I didn't. Like, I didn't. And so instantly that guilt kind of crept in of like, what were you doing that was so important that you couldn't see that he was struggling? And you were out for like I think it was like 28 hours, maybe longer. And so in those 28 hours, I went through every emotion possible. I mean, I was sad. I was mad. I was angry. I mean, I was just confused. All of that. So, and then when you finally woke up, there was this sense of relief of like, God, you carried him through. Like, thank you. So,
I don't mind sharing anything from my recovery, but that's still like I still struggle sometimes with just this immense sense of shame about it, and I don't know what it is. I don't know. And I've worked on it through my inventory, and I've gotten to the point now where when we talk about it, I don't it was like the one thing I'd never wanted to talk about. And Natalie will tell you that, and anybody that knows me, that I don't really, there's not really anything off limits for me to talk
mhm.
about. Like I don't shy away from talking about tough things. And that one was one that like I didn't even want to talk about it. I didn't want to talk about it. I want to hear about it. I just didn't want to think that I had gotten so out of control. Like there's something about losing complete control of myself that terrified me. And just the amount of shame and then to think what I did to like you and my family and your family, and it just it still hurts to think about. And that's just me. I was mind you, I was unconscious for the entire experience. So what you went through was infinitely worse. But, I remember taking something I had never taken before, thinking like this is not working, and then taking more, and then oh, it's still not working, and then next thing I know, like I remember like fade to black, and I remember my eyes being closed, and I remember hearing the heart monitor and going, "What is that noise?" And then like I opened my eyes for like just a second, and I remember seeing my aunt and uncle and you, and like thinking like, "Oh shit." Like, and then I fell back asleep, and then I eventually woke up, and but there was also this sense of relief that I felt like the word's out. Like I don't have to hide this anymore, but I still wasn't ready to quit. And so there were certain things that I avoided, Like think honestly, you want to talk about God working, and not only did he keep me alive, but if that overdose hadn't happened, who knows where I would have ended up.
Mm,
Because that kind of scared me away just enough from really hard stuff to that I didn't end up trying heroin or, getting caught stealing from somebody or like I mean, I don't know where it would have taken me.
right.
And to this day, there's still a part of me that has fear that like there's nothing that I won't do if given the opportunity. Like I recognize that despite my best efforts, there's just some part of me that seeks comfort and escape and being removed from reality. And despite all of the terrible things that I had caused and all of the harm that I had done to you and my family, I wasn't ready to quit yet. And I did engage with recovery for the first time really in any meaningful sense. I definitely wouldn't say that it was I wasn't surrendered for sure, but it was I worked the program, but I wasn't.
I I
No, I
wouldn't say
did.
you worked you never did the steps.
I started the steps, but I didn't finish the steps. But like what I'm saying is it's the first time I'd engaged with it with the
Yeah.
understanding that I was an addict. maybe that's a better way to say it. I wouldn't say I did it well because it took me 7 more years to finally surrender. But it did. There were a lot of times when I think back to that, there were a lot of times, a lot of seeds that were planted from that. And again, kind of talking about how God will take something completely dysfunctional and broken and somehow make it something just pure and beautiful. He'd taken my overdose, and not only did it introduce me to Celebrate Recovery and I had known about Celebrate Recovery and I had been to a few meetings, but it was the first time that, like I said, I engaged with it as an addict.
Mm-hmm.
And so not only did it expose me to that, but it also brought you in because you wanted to support me,
Mm-hmm.
which is how we get codependence and CR. that's how we get you.
Right.
And that, like, you ask almost any codependent in this group or at Celebrate Recovery, and they will tell you, I came here to support somebody else. And I think one of the formative experiences in that initial stint of being exposed to recovery as an addict was I'd had this overdose. I was terrified what people would think because, I'm the pastor's nephew. I up to the point of my overdose, was the youth pastor for a very short-lived time. That was a terrible experience. I'm just not youth pastor material anyways, but God bless you youth pastors out there. You guys are built different. But I remember sitting in a meeting and knowing that I needed to share what happened, but I was so scared of what people would think. So I fought it. And finally, towards the end of the meeting, I start to share about my overdose and everything. And I'm weeping into my hands. I will not look at anybody. Like, I am weeping. And when I finally was done and I looked up and looked around, I don't know why I was expecting like a bunch of shock and disappointment and just I was expecting somebody to be incredulous about it. And in the best way possible, nobody gave a shit. And I say that because it was just like, I don't know how to describe it because I've never experienced anything like it since, that nobody batted an eye. Nobody was like, it was nothing but like this very calm, kind of like somewhat muted, like just kind of nodding heads like, hey man, business as usual around here. Like, you're in the right place. And that moment stuck with me forever because even though that little stint engaging with Celebrate Recovery didn't stick, it set the precedent that when I'm ready to give this up, Celebrate Recovery will always be there for me to go back to. And, eventually I kind of went through this spiral of self-sabotage cycle of self-sabotage that I found myself going in over and over and over with my using career, where I would get a little bit of recovery, things would kind of start changing for the better, and then I'd have this sense of like this. Eventually, the other shoe's going to drop, and the world's going to crash down around me. The sky's going to fall. So I'm just going to do it myself. I'm going to go back out on my terms because that way, I really showed my addiction who's boss that way. But it was some feeble attempt at control, is really what it was.
Oh, I remember there was one time where you had relapsed again, and I was so angry, and I was just like, I believe in you. Everybody else believes in you, but you don't. I'm like, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's not going to drop. So you know what you do? You just take it and you throw it because that's just like, you just need to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it was. It was just like, I could see, everyone else could see, but you just couldn't. You weren't there.
Yeah, and when I finally did get sober, there were so many people that came up to me that were like, "We knew you'd get it eventually." Like it was such a welcome. Again, it was like version 2.0 of that welcoming experience of like, you belong here. Like, this is a place for you. And when I eventually in 2020 did get sober, I realized that like, this is my home. Like, this is a place for me. This is a shelter in any storm where I can not only share my burdens, but share my burdens with other people, and they can share their burdens with me, and we can share our successes with each other, and we can share experience with each other. And that's why these fellowships, again, no matter which one you're a part of, I feel like they're so vital. And there's a reason why I think they're called fellowships, is because you need that, having that that community, um, and living life with other people who struggle with what you struggle with is just, it makes the fight so much easier.
Mhm.
Um, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but eventually, I was maybe sober for 2 or 3 months, and then eventually went back out, and but you didn't. So, what was that experience like for you? Because you went in to support me. So tell me how that came to be that you ended up working recovery this entire time since that point, even when I went back out.
So, well, when I went to my very first group, I went into the codependency group, and I remember leaving, and I was just like, I am never going back in there. My heart was broken. And I remember talking to my sponsor about it, and she's like, Natalie, perspective. And I'm like, perspective? Because in the group, everybody wanted their husbands to die. They were so done. Perspective. I'm 3 months into marriage. They're 5, 10 plus years into marriage, with addicts. And I was just like, I don't want him to die. I truly did not want him to die. And it broke my heart. And I couldn't be around people like that. And so I went into a different group and found community. And I think for me, it was, I knew that I couldn't fix you on my own. And having people to support us and that knew who you were, because Matt as an addict isn't Matt. Like they're two totally different people. And when you talk to people that don't know you, it was hard. It was hard to remove the judgment, I guess, is what I want to say. But I knew that I needed people around us. So for a while, I still did it for us. And then, going through it, it was like, okay, like there's things that I need to work on. I didn't contribute to his overdose by any means, but I can be better. And it helped me learn to stand on my own. That I was, because I struggled with identity so much and figuring out where I fit, right? And so it was like softball player, and then it quickly changed into like damaged goods, right? From the abuse, and then it was Matt's girlfriend, and then it was Matt's wife. Like there was never like Natalie, right? I didn't know who that was. So I started the journey on figuring out who I am, and doing a lot of heart work on, worthiness, because when that happened internally, it triggered well, this is what you deserve. Like it's not all perfect. And, and all those thoughts crept back in of like, if you would have been better, if you would have, the ifs. And so I had to come into a community where I could get myself better, because I realized that I couldn't be there for you if I didn't know who I was. So in a way, I worked the program for you, but then God just works and twists it around, and whatever it takes to get you in the door, He does the rest. But the walls of recovery saved our marriage.
100%. Yeah. Specifically what God did through them. But yeah, whenever we say stuff like that, like recovery is the reason I'm alive. Recovery, I genuinely believe, and not, again, kind of to keep this inclusive to all the recovery fellowships, not every recovery program is Christ-centered. There's a lot of biblical basis and references that I think greatly inspired things like AA, which in turn, AA inspired NA, and eventually I know CR took a lot of things from AA. But, for our higher power, I believe that God works through all of this. This is just a way that He works through this, or works It's just something he works through. There we go. English. Um, but when you say you knew you couldn't fix me, you didn't know that right away.
Mm-mm.
And so I think it's important to talk about, because there are people that might be listening to this that aren't familiar with recovery or aren't familiar with what codependency is. And so what let's what did your codependency look like when you started versus where your work with Julie Batty, your sponsor, how did that process look for you when as you worked your own recovery, where again you say God started to address some of those things in your life? What did that look like for you with your codependency?
Um,
When you started, did you think that you would be able to help fix me?
I think my hope was that I could lead by example.
Okay.
I don't know if it was that I could help fix you, really. I think it was like, how can I be better for him? And that in itself is codependency. It's not how can I get better for me, it's how can I get better to support him. And that's codependency.
Right.
That's doing something for somebody else at the sacrifice of yourself.
And good intention, but
100%.
what in what negative ways did that approach affect you?
Well, I mean, I started neglecting myself. It was all about what was in the house, could he canceling plans, like should we go to this restaurant because, alcohol's going to be served, or any of that kind of thing, like hyper focused on, I remember I have a lot of health issues and back pain, and so it was like, well, I can't take that in the house, or like, modifying things, which isn't a bad thing. Like I mean, obviously there's when you're in a relationship with somebody in addiction, like you're obviously going to have to take some extra precaution. But it was to the point where I was neglecting myself to help you.
Yeah, those aren't bad things. And to this day, there are times, I had, um, again, I started this new job. It's been awesome. But I had the conversation with my boss, because I work for a sales department, that like, there are times that you go out to dinner with clients and stuff like that. I'm like, there's certain things that I just can't do. Like, I can't go to a bar. I can go out to dinner and like people can have drinks at dinner, and that doesn't bother me, but it's hard for me to be at a place. There's certain places I can't go, like bars, when the entire social interaction is through the lens of alcohol. It's just something I can't do, and that's just a personal decision I made for myself. It doesn't mean that I'm like, you heathens or whatever. It's not a judgmental thing. It's just something I know I can't do. But those things are fine, because those are my decisions I am making for me to protect my sobriety. You can't make that decision for me,
Correct.
because then it becomes
Well,
you become my parole officer.
and I think it's important to note at that time, though, it wasn't even drinking yet. I mean, that was still social.
Hmm.
Um, and so, and really being so blinded to the fact that it kind of carries over. Like, it's just like,
Right.
it's very fluid, and addiction is an addiction, whether it's,
Drinking does tend to be fluid, yes.
haha. Um, so God quickly shifted it, though, from about Matt to about Natalie. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that he did that. I think, though, that I still had to, I was denying the grieving process of what our marriage was going to be. And I think that,
What do you mean by that?
well, I mean, when you get married, you have this idea of like what everything is going to like what everything's going to be like, right? Like,
Right.
we're gonna get married, and then we're gonna both have jobs. And I was in school in that time, right? And so I was gonna graduate, and we're gonna have kids, and like life, we'll go out with our friends, and like what that looked like in that time, right?
Mhm.
Like, and so I had to grieve that. I had to grieve the fact that he wasn't perfect, and grieve the fact that I couldn't fix him, and accept the fact that this has nothing to do with me.
Mhm.
So those are like the biggest things in the beginning that God shifted me. And the grieving process took forever. I mean, it was not, I think there's still moments that I have to remind myself like this just isn't a part of our story. Um, and there are times where selfishly I get frustrated. I'm like, well, I wish we could, and but then God quickly is like, but is it worth it? It's like, no, that's really stupid. Um, but it is a constant process of being reminded that what I had in mind pales in comparison of what he has planned.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the grieving process for you, and I hear people like, I think one of the worst things that we can do as human beings is deny ourselves. If something's bothering you and it's lost to you, it's okay to grieve it. Even
Hmm.
doesn't mean that you're like sackcloth and ashes and like
Right.
wailing in the streets, but it's okay to be like, I'm really disappointed. This isn't a thing for me anymore. Like, this is gonna seem unrelated, but you know, talking with somebody who was on the verge of losing a pet that they've had, that was with them for really hard times in their life, and they're like, I know it's stupid, it's just a dog, and I'm like, no, like, it, that pet means something to you, and
Hmm.
and you know, it's okay to grieve things that are bothering you, you're gonna lose, and I grieve. There are times that like I had to go through a real grieving process when I eventually stopped drinking. Of like, there were times that like I'm I was just like, I would get mad at myself, like, why can't you just drink like a normal person? Like, why can't you go out and have a beer with your friends and like, or, like, because there were a lot of really good times where I went out and drank responsibly, had a beer with friends, and like enjoyed company, and it was fine, and good conversations, and just, but and then you take a step back, and there is a part of me that's like, yeah, that's silly though, like it's silly that you miss it, but it's not. I'm not really grieving alcohol in that
Hmm.
moment. I'm grieving the fact that there are some things that I just can't do that I wish I could. Alcohol, don't get me wrong. I mean, until the day die, there will be some hopefully ever shrinking part of me that misses alcohol for alcohol and what it does for me. But it's also, if in those moments it was like, it's weird. It's hard being different, right? Like when we go to weddings, like, and everybody's drinking and having a good time, and I'm like, there's part of me that's like, I can't partake in that same way. And so there's a part of me that's like, oh, man, like it sucks. But eventually, through working the steps and kind of working the program, I realized that like that's just kind of life for me. And it doesn't make like it there's nothing you can say that's going to make it not hard sometimes, but that's fine. Like
Hmm.
I came to terms with the fact that there's some things in life that kind of suck, and it's okay. Like it's fine. Like for all of the things that I don't get to do, I look at my life now and I look at all the things that I do get a chance to take to enjoy, and it's just like that was 100% worth it. And you said earlier that Matt and addiction is not who Matt really is. And that's been the process that God's been taking me through I would say this last year and a half, and realizing that, and this kind of ties back. So bear with me. I'm gonna backtrack us just a little bit. But you said that the Matt in addiction is not who Matt really is. Well, the Matt in addiction, there are certain things that are a part of who I am that can be used for both good and evil. Like I tend to be pretty resourceful as a person. I'm pretty like I'm good at, like, if I want to hide something from you, I'll probably find a way to hide it for a while. I'm not as smart as I think I am. Eventually everybody catches on. But
Hmm.
and especially, I was playing with house money at that point because you had no idea what was happening. But you know, like the fact that you didn't know what was going on in that those early stages of my addiction was by design. I didn't want you to know.
And I think that's important for the spouse of someone in addiction is like that is what makes an addict an addict.
Right.
It has nothing to do with you not picking up on anything.
Right. It's not
That's the heart of that's the heart. And like what I've realized too is, people don't go into relationships without I did not go into marriage with you not trusting you. There was no doubt in my mind that you would not deceive me, that you would not lie, that you would not cheat, steal, kill, whatever, right? Like, that's not something that's in the forefront of your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's important to remind yourself if you're in the situation is that's an addict. It has nothing to do with you.
But you made the important distinction, though, that me in addiction was not me. And
Correct.
I did not believe that when I was in addiction. I'm like, this is who I am.
Yeah.
Like, this is me in full depravity is who I really am in the inside. That's kind of that fatalistic view of myself was like, this is who I really am. And now that I've kind of
that used to make me so mad.
I used to say that all the time. And I used to say this line to Randy in this step study. I'm going to bring it up when I finally get a chance to get him in here to do his episode. That's being Randy Holly, who is the leader of Carol and Randy Holly are the leaders of the Celebrate Recovery we attend. And Randy was leading the step study I got sober in. And I used to say all the time, and it would drive him crazy. I'd be like, I trust more that I will fuck up my life than I trust that God can save me. I'm sorry. I say this every time because my aunt and my grandma laugh at me, but my grandma doesn't like when I cuss, but that's what I said. That's how I felt. And it was,
you work an honest program.
I work an honest program. But it was, I genuinely believe that I believed more in my ability to fuck up than I believed that God could save me. And, it's funny now working recovery, and God's been taking me through this season where I've finally come to accept that you were right, that who I am is not who I was as an addict. Now, if I can be that person again, if I make the choices that lead me down that path.
No. You can take on that role.
No,
the root of the person. No.
Are we about to have a philosophical difference?
We are, because at the root of who you are, addiction does not exist. The root of who you are is someone who is caring, who is confident, who will do anything for anyone, who doesn't think of himself first. The addiction part of Matt takes over and becomes self-centered and manipulative. That's not who you are. Those are just masks. It's just the role that you play in addiction.
Okay.
The root of you does not change.
Yeah.
I truly believe that there are, an addict is not, and going back, the reason that we introduce ourselves the way we do, right? So I'm Natalie, a grateful believer who struggles with, but my identity is who I am. My struggle does not define who I am.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like we're probably saying pretty much the same thing, but just from different perspectives. Yeah, okay. All right. Anyways, I'm bouncing around a lot. I'm going to get back and finish my point eventually. So let me do that before we go too far. Well, let me do that right after this. But the way I see this, and this is like a big societal debate, right? Go on. If you ever want to see how differing the opinions are about addiction in our society, just go on any news post on Facebook or Twitter, and with the headline of Warren County man overdoses on heroin and crashes in a car, or what are we going to do about the heroin epidemic, or what are we going to do about addiction? And you'll see people that are like, let them die, like fuck them, like they made this bed, they can lay in it. And then you've got other people who are like, it's not their fault, it's a sickness. And the fact is, personally, I think they're both partially right and partially wrong. And I'm going to explain why. Natalie's giving me this look where she's getting fired up over there. But I think it's both a choice. So the debate is addiction a choice or is addiction a sickness? And I think it's partially both. And that's not a cop out answer. That's not a like let's all just get along, man. We're both can be right or we no, like in my personal experience, I genuinely believe that it's both. In the sense that let's say that I am diabetic. I'm not trying to alienate those with diabetes out there. But let's say I'm diabetic. I'm not. By the grace of God, somehow in my terrible treatment of my body, I'm not. But so if I'm diabetic, that is not who I am as a person, but it is a illness, correct? At the same time, if I had diabetes, if I was born with it, let's say I was born with it, right? That's not my fault. It's just it happens. It sucks. It's an unfortunate reality of my life that I am a diabetic, and I was born with it. And there's in this hypothetical situation, for this example, it is not my fault. It just sucks, but it's reality. It's not my fault. It is a sickness. But if I choose to live on ice cream and M&Ms my entire life, and then I die, that was a choice that I made, knowing that I am diabetic. I know that while being an addict is not who I am at my core, I know that I am who God says I am. But as long as I am on this earth and I am still a part, as long as I am still human, there is a part of me that is capable of always going back to being an addict. And so I make decisions that, like I said, like I don't go to bars. If like there's a Chinese place we like nearby. There's a shop right nearby that sells kratom. In fact, I went and got dinner for us Friday night, and I don't know why I have never seen the sign. They've got this big flashing LED sign that's like kratom, 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 and I parked right in front of it. And so, like, when I see that, there's a couple decisions that I have to make. One, don't go in. And two, I call somebody, and I'm like, hey, I saw this, like, because there's a brief moment in my mind that's like, oh, yeah, I remember that. And I'm like, nope. Like, I'm not doing that. And so I know that I have a choice to make with that. And I could either just keep that in and let it fester, or I can call Kyle or my sponsor or whoever and be like, I saw this. I'm good. I'm fine. It's not a crisis, but I want to let you know I had this,
You take the thought captive.
Yes. It's an involuntary thought. I can't help those. I can't help the fact that I have thoughts about addiction sometimes, but I do have a responsibility, if I want to be sober, to take steps to mitigate those things, to protect my sobriety and continue working the program. In the same way that if you're a diabetic, there's certain things you can't do. You can't eat sugar, or you shouldn't. And so, like, maybe going to Dairy Queen, not such a good idea. Like, just stay away. What I'm saying is there are choices involved that you have to make. And so I think that people will struggle with addiction. I genuinely believe that for a lot of us, there is a genetic, psychological, physiological, experiential, something led us to the point that there's something in our brain that doesn't know how to process, mind-altering substances or pornography or whatever in a way that is healthy by any means. And so that is like I can't help that my brain has that part that makes me more susceptible to addiction. But now that I'm exposed to recovery and I'm exposed to working a program, I do have the responsibility now, or at least I don't have the excuse of saying I didn't know.
Right.
And so I don't want to be when I refer to like the addict side of me and the who I really am. What I'm saying is I can make the choices that the addiction part of me, the part of my being, that one day when I'm in the presence of God, I will not have to struggle with anymore. On time being, I have that here. And so I am capable of letting that part of me take over, and it buries everything good in me. In some ways, it twists the good things about me, and I end up using them in self-serving ways, like being resourceful, like being manipulative. Um, you know, with this new job, this is a different career, I wasn't sure how it was going to go, but God, I remember I haven't had a chance to talk to my sponsor much, and he called me, and I stepped into another room and was just kind of chatting with him, and he was asking me how work was going, and man, I've just been blown away about how much I've enjoyed it, how much I've been good at it so quickly, and it's not. I told Mitch, I'm like, again, I'm not going to say exactly. You guys can. But I said either I'm the luckiest MFer I've ever met, or God has ordered my steps through this entire thing. And Mitch says, in classic Mitch way, goes, well, if you want to know the answer to that question, have you ever won the lottery? I was like, nope. I was like, I've never been struck by lightning either, so I'll keep that in mind the next time I feel like that I'm screwing my life up and I'm just cursed. I'll know that like I'm just not that unlucky either. And God has just ordered my steps in this, put me in a position that I've been able to see that like all of these things that were bad about me when I was using, now that I'm sober, I realize now that I've kind of peeled back all of the callousness and the wounds and the scar tissue, all of a sudden that resourcefulness is serving me. It allows me to serve others. It allowed me to start this podcast. Like this is something that there's just something in me that enjoys like building something and creating something from the ground up that like, like I recognize that like it's a gift. It's something that God has given me that allows me to do certain things. And so it served me in a way. My creativity has served me now, and used my creativity when I was using was mainly used to how can I hide this from Natalie, and now it's used to do things like the podcast, or it's serving me at work or with music. And what I've realized is that I finally kind of come to terms that like I am not the piece of shit that I thought I was all of those years. And I genuinely believe that I was scum of the earth, that I didn't deserve. I genuinely felt like I was a net negative to everybody who cared about me, to the point that there were many times that I looked at you when we would be arguing, like, why are you here? I don't know how many times I told you that. Like, why are you here? Why are you still here? Why haven't you left? And I know it was harder for you to stay than it would have been for you to leave. I recognize that 100%. And
It was, but it wasn't. Like for me, God God kept reminding me that when I took my vows, I said in sickness and in health. And he quickly reminded me that sickness isn't just like the man flu. Like addiction is a sickness, addiction is an illness, depression, mental health, that's all an illness, right? And so God sustained that in me of like, there was never an option to leave. And really, in some twisted way, that was like my spiritual awakening was when I was able to say, like, I don't need him anymore. I want him, but I don't need him. And like, but leaving you, yes, I mean, obviously it would have been easier. I mean, nobody would doubt that. I mean, we had 2 kids when you were in addiction, like one of which was in
I
the
wouldn't recommend it.
right, one of
God
which was
worked
in
it out, but
the peak of your addiction, had a child, and but it was never an option. Like I was never. Did I want to give up? Yes, there were so many times where I'm like, I am just so done. Like I am tired. I love him more than he loves himself, and it's frustrating. But that's where community comes back in. That's where working the program of being able to focus on myself um, helped. I mean, I needed something to take my mind away from you long enough, and so the Walls of Recovery and our prayer ministry around here, like it was times where in this very room I would come crawling in like I'm tired, I'm done. And God would use our prayer team to just speak truth. And and the countless hours that we and times that we had prayed for you. And it was never God, God make him sober. It was God show him his worth. Um, let him know that he's loved. Um, but I think had I not been in recovery, I wouldn't have known to do that. I wouldn't have
Yeah.
known to pray not for sobriety. I knew that that was a side effect of your worth.
Well, sobriety, if you're around CR, you'll hear it long, and I'm sure this is probably said in the other fellowships as well, that sometimes you got to fake it till you make it. And sobriety, once I had surrendered, once I had surrendered, sobriety fell into place. I'm not saying it wasn't hard and I didn't have to work it, but it just clicked with me. And I recognized that this was my way out. But I did not feel any sense of worth for a long time. And I really struggled with that. I really struggled with not feeling like I was worth anything. I mean, I struggled with that. I walked into this new job like actively fighting against this constant feeling of feeling like an imposter. I'm like, I have somehow fooled these people so much that they're willing to take a shot on me, even though I don't have any experience in this industry. And what they saw in me was more than I saw in myself. And that was that, like, we think these guys going to be a good fit. Think he fits in with the culture here. We think he's smart enough to learn whatever we throw at him. And this is not me assuming. These are things that were said to me. And I still didn't believe it when I started. And then to watch God put it together for me. There were a couple lessons that he's taught me through this new job thing. One, it's that it's okay to recognize there are good things about yourself. It's okay to put yourself in a position to best utilize those things that you're good at. The other part of it is, Matt, you don't know how to handle good times very well. Because normally in my life, there was never any good moment in my life that wasn't immediately followed by devastation of some sort. This is how my childhood was. Every time that there was a good moment, chaos and absolute just panic would ensue with something else after that. And in my mind, I've always made the correlation that when things are good, be worried because something really bad is around the corner. And so there's a part of me that the addict life was easier for me in certain ways because when you're an addict, I controlled the quote unquote good times with my using, right? And I knew what to expect after. There was never going to be anything that surprised me. But I was okay with my life sucking all the time because of my using, because if it sucks now, then I don't have to be surprised by something worse later. And it took me a while, but what I eventually figured out was like, that just leaves you to being alone or dead or both. And so, it kind of takes us in where I wanted to go next was, as you continue working your recovery, COVID hits, I get laid off, and I decide that if there is ever a time for me to just lean into my using, this was going to be it. And so I did. And at this point, you knew what I was doing. You knew what was going on. I wasn't hiding it from you anymore. And around that time, we also had that conversation where you said, I don't need you anymore. And you didn't say it as I'm leaving. You didn't say it as I don't want you. You said, I don't need you anymore.
There was no malice in it.
There was no malice. And I didn't, and it stunned me. And I was not ready for that. And
mind you, too, this is like 6 years into me working a program.
Yeah, it took a while. It took me 10 years to get sober. So you're ahead of me on that curve. But I remember I wasn't angry at you. I didn't feel hurt by it in the sense like it hurt me, but not in a you hurt me kind of way. In a realization that if I don't figure something out, if I don't get out of this cycle, I'm going to end up divorced, and then I'm probably going to end up dead. And I'm like, okay. And that about that time is when Randy had approached me a couple times and said, like, hey, we're starting the step study. You want to do it? And I honestly had zero expectations that it was going to go anywhere because I had quit more step studies than I remember at this point. And but I was like, you know what? If I'm going to do it, I'm going to be brutally honest with how I feel about things, with the doubts that I have of whether or not I can even get sober, and the frustration that I have about this whole faith component part of working this program, because I don't understand why I need it. It's frustrating that I have to have it, but it seems to be the only thing that I haven't tried, but I don't like, why is this the thing? And, out of that came the infamous story with Randy where I'm sitting there and I'm bemoaning, my mantra about I believe more in my ability to fuck up my life than I believe that God can get me sober. And and I'm saying, like, I don't understand why God can't just sit across in this table and just talk to me and tell me that he's real. Then I wouldn't need to have faith. I would just know that he could keep me sober. And Randy, looks at me, and the only way Randy can, and just goes, why don't you try faith? Like, why don't you try it? Which I say this every time I put it this way every time I give my testimony, that in any other time in my life, I would have taken that in the same way a drowning man would have taken somebody saying, why don't you try swimming? But it just clicked with me. I realized I have tried everything else. And I don't understand this faith part, but I'm out of options. I am at the end of my rope. Something's got to give. And so I prayed. I've told the story probably enough times that people are getting sick of it on the podcast, but I prayed, God, like, I don't know if you can get me sober. I don't know if you can save me. But if I'm going to get sober, you're going to have to do it. I will do whatever you tell me to do, but you're the one that's got to make this happen. And I came home that night and I grabbed my stash, like full stash, just spent a lot of money I should not have spent on it. But I came home. I didn't say anything to you. Do you remember that moment of me walking through the house?
I do.
What was going through your mind when you saw that?
Do you realize how much money you're throwing away?
Yeah.
I mean, because at this point, we're going to backpedal.
You could take the girl out of the codependency, but you can't take the codependency out of the girl.
Well, I mean, so up until this point, you had...
I'm joking, by the way.
...been hiding. I mean, and if I can get any message across to an addict that's married, it's not the addiction, it's the lying and manipulation. Mm-hmm. That is what... I was at the point where I was like, he's going to use. So you might as well just tell me. And I mean, I had said that for so long. And then finally it was like, he's like, okay. And so he started. And so it was at the point where I was like in acceptance of it, right? Like, this is just going to happen. And so when that had happened, when he came, it was like, I literally just saw the dollar signs, and I was so frustrated at that point too, just with like, he's not working, and we're paying for childcare and all this stuff, right? At that point we were, and so it was just like all the financial, not important stuff, right? But I was like, I literally only saw dollar signs going in there. And then I heard him twist open the bottle and dump the pills out into the garbage can. And I was like, oh shit, this is real. Like, it just got real. It wasn't like he threw them away, like bottle closed.
I can go get them later.
Right.
No, I fully committed.
And
was there any part of you that was skeptical?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Well, rude. I had such a good track record up to that point. I don't understand how you'd feel that way.
I mean, I think it was just shock because there was no like, so like in all of the years leading up to that, like the prayer, and I never will forget this, when we were first married, we had a couple pray over us, and they just prayed that we were going to be mothers and fathers of the faith, that God would use us to greater the kingdom as a married couple. And Like, even when when you were in like the heart of your addiction, people would pray that, and it used to make me so mad. I'm like, well, I'm here. Where's the Father? I'm not going to be a single mom of the faith. Like, um, so there was a part of me that was like, is this really happening? Like, there was never like
I mean, it was a shock because I didn't even go to. Listen. I went to that meeting. I finally surrendered. No intention of stopping.
no.
None. And so I can understand for you. You're like, okay, what has changed? We hadn't talked to that point either.
Well, you wouldn't talk to me either because you just said shut up when you went out the door.
Well, what you didn't realize was the tug of war going on in my mind,
No,
and so I was just like, I just let me do this. I got to do this. Let me do this before I change my mind.
and I get that. So, yeah.
So as I started, I mean, there's the subconscious effect of me using that you still had to kind of work through and that we had to deal with. But as I continued my sobriety, what like through that first year, what is it? What did that like? What were you going through with that? Like, what was going through your mind? Like, was there a point that you were like, okay, this is I think he's got like I think it's clicked with him. I don't want to say like he's got and he's cured forever because I know that's never what you thought, but
To be honest, I don't think I did.
you don't think you ever had a moment?
Not that first year, no. It was when you hit 18 months, and I was like, holy crap, like, this is real. Like, this is real. I mean, I had hopes that that was happening, but I don't think it was like the reality check did not hit until, and I remember it, your 18 month. Because you had 18 months when I hit my 8 year. I didn't, because it was always like I, I didn't want to, I didn't want to accept it if it was not going to stick. Like, I didn't want to believe that it was true until I knew it was true.
You didn't want to get your hopes up.
Right. And I think and I lived life like I had when you were in addiction that first year.
Yeah.
It took a while, and that was probably one of the most difficult things when you got sober was realizing that, like, it sounds so bad, but like the girls and I would just do stuff, right? And we would just leave. We didn't really talk to you about where we were going or invite you because at that I got so upset that every time I would invite you, you'd be like, no, I'm not going. So I just stopped and we would go. And then I remember we did something and I was like, oh crap, I probably should ask him if he wants to go. Like, it just didn't click to me because it was just it was just how life was for so long. It was just like, I'm just going to go. And then you were like, well, what are you doing today? And I'm like, oh. And then it clicked, like, probably should tell him what's going on. You know what I mean? And like, and then that started a whole different life of a whole new level of recovery for me of like, what does life look like being married to Matt sober?
Yeah. I mean, there's been a struggle since I've been sober that we've dealt with, and we're still working on it. But I feel like we kind of talked it out and came to terms with it. I'd probably say a couple months ago, something like that. And actually, pretty much when I started this job, I think it was about that time. And I recognize again, like it's it's weird sometimes being the addict because you bring so much visceral devastation to the people around you, and then when you get better, like sometimes you forget that, like, okay, like all the people around you have learned to deal with your addiction and now you're moving on. It doesn't mean that they're going to move along with you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they've got to work through things in their own way. And this kind of goes through what you experience with the amends process, especially as an addict, where you have to be okay with some people not being ready to forgive you yet. The amends is not for them, it's for you. I mean, in some ways it's for them, but it's your amends, the part of your amends that you can control only goes up to the point that you say, I'm changing my life. I'm doing the best that I can to be better. And that is, and there are other amends that you can make financially or sometimes. And so I'm not speaking to that. I'm talking mainly about the relational amends. And a lot of times the only thing that you can do is say, hey, I know I did this. I was wrong. I'm sorry for the harm I caused you. And I'm the active part of the amends is what we would refer to as like a living amends of I'm going to live my life better. And I know that I can't make up for the harm that I caused. And I know that I can't take it back, but this is what I'm doing now. And what's kind of unfair about the amends process for an addict is that this is going to seem somewhat cold, but I can't control how you choose to deal with the harm that I caused you.
Mm-hmm.
It's not your fault that I did it to you, but it is your responsibility now to choose to do the right thing with it or not. And that sounds it like hurts my soul a little bit when I say that, because I've had to talk about it before when Kyle and I led the Last Step study, and like it's not fair. It's not, but it is the reality of how things are. And I wish that there were things that I could do to make that hurt go away for you and the other people that I've harmed, but I can't. It is out of the scope of in which I am capable to take that away from you. And so there was this tension that you and I had when I got sober, where I'm just like, I understood it for the first year of like, you were still treating me as if I was using. And I think it was about to that 18-month point where I was finally like, hey, how long do I have to be sober before you buy in? Like, I totally understand. I never once lost touch with the fact that you would be skeptical or that you would have a hard time with it. And once I came to that realization that like, hey, like just because you're getting better doesn't mean that the devastation you have caused is going to magically poof and go away.
And it's not just that though. It's the way that life. I mean, you go into your new norm, and that was just life. That's just how it was. And so, as much of a good life disruptor as getting sober is, it's still an adjustment. And when you've lived that way for so long, it's hard to pivot, right? And then and God for us, He provided such supernatural grace during your addiction that when you got sober, God was like, all right, now let's deal with it. And I'm like, what the heck is happening? Like emotions I had never felt before came back. So that first year I'm going over, I'm really in the root of having to do the grieving process and actually processing what all had happened up until that point. And then, fast forward to where we're at now, and I'm in a step study, and I'm being hit hard. I mean, like hard by spiritual attack, of just like thoughts and irrational thoughts and just like frustration and all of these emotions. And I'm really ticked off because I'm like, I don't understand like what's going on. I'm frustrated because I know that the thoughts don't have truth. They're not justified thoughts. They're irrational thoughts. There's nothing that has happened that would warrant having those thoughts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I'm frustrated, and I remember like I'm leading this step study. This is like step study number 4. And I was at group, and I was with my co-leader, and I was like, I'm having these thoughts, and I know up here, I'm pointing my head, like, I know that they're not true. Like, and I know in my heart that it's not true, but like, I can't stop them, and I can't stop the feelings that are happening and the emotions and the physical response. and everything. And she prayed with me, and I went home that night, and I was just like, God, I can't do this. I'm going, this is when I get to ruin our marriage. Like, this is it. Like, is this what you want for me? Like, you saved it to now for me to just, open a big bag of crazy. Um, and he was like, this is the first time that you've been safe doing an inventory. And I'm like, hmm. And it was true. I mean, like, I had worked a program, but emotionally safe being that you were emotionally available to support me in that. And that helped a lot. It helped me be able to talk to you about what was going on and the thoughts and you know, I think had I not, I think God knew that there was going to be a learning curve for me in adjusting to life, because I settled in the fact that this was just how life was. This is just how it is. Like, I'd accept the fact that you were not going to be somebody that was going to, want to go do everything with me and be fully present. And so that was just life. And I had gotten to that point. So it was like, life had changed. And then all of a sudden it was out of nowhere, and it was abrupt. Um, and it took me a while. And then you went into a step study again right afterwards. And so I was like, I'd been used to not, taking time. And then you're like, hey, I think you should do a step study. And I was like, you think I should do a step study? Just getting defensive. And yeah, so it's, you getting sober didn't fix everything. And I think that was a hard reality.
It was for both of us, yeah. But it was a good lesson because
It just goes to show too, though, that like, just because you got sober, it didn't mean that I could stop working a program.
right.
Like, I had to really press in at that point. And
Yeah.
I think initially I was like, I could breathe, and that caused trauma. That caused issues where when that happens, I needed to push into recovery more than I had when you were using.
Yeah. Like I lived most of my adult life in survival mode. Like I was still stuck back in the days of my childhood when things were chaotic and crazy and dysfunctional. And I could not get past living life like that. And there's still part of me that carries that. Like there's part of me that, like, to this day, like, a crisis doesn't freak me out. Like, I've been conditioned to, like, feel comfortable in a crisis, and now I now I try not to. I think I've done a pretty good job through God working in my life to not create those crises, those, yeah, whatever those are, whatever the plural is for crisis,
The times of crisis.
whatever. I don't create them anymore. Not to say that I don't cause hardship sometimes, because I'm still a jerk sometimes, but you reminded me of that when I got sober. And like, you were still in crisis mode,
Mhm.
and it like took you a while to get out of like that survivor mode. And so working in recovery, I want to be delicate with how I say this, but there are certain guys that I see. I'm going to say guys because that's mainly who I deal with, but I see who are getting sober for maybe the first time, and they've caused, through their addiction, have caused a lot of crisis, caused a lot of dysfunction, caused a lot of turmoil and wreckage. And they get sober, and then they're kind of like shocked when people aren't like on board with it. Like, they're skeptical, or
Woo!
they're like, yeah, they're not jumping for joy, or sometimes they're just downright like mean about it, and like put them down. And I'll see them, and they get so mad, like, man, like they almost, like, I could see it in their face. I've never heard anybody actually say this, but the way they word things is like, what if nobody's going to believe me, then why am I even doing this? And I know that those dudes are in trouble. Like, it makes me, I know that anything's possible. If I could get sober, anybody can get sober. But that what that points to me is that, like, okay, their mind might not be totally in the right place for their sobriety, and just the unfortunate reality is most of the time they don't make it. And I while it was hard, and I like, even when I didn't understand what was going on, and even when I did with you and your struggles with it, like, I never took it personally. Like, I was like, "Hey, you can't treat me this way. Like, this is not, we can't live life this way. Like, you have to address this." And kind of the double-edged sword of us both working in recovery is that there were certain things that you were not going to be able to get away with, because I'm like, "Hey, we work the same program, lady, and you know this part of the program, like, we both worked that." And so there is some accountability in our marriage where, like, I'm like, "Hey, you can't do this." Like, and it's not a finger wagging, not throwing the law book at you kind of way. At least that I didn't mean for it to be the way. If I did, this is the part where she's like, "Well, you did," but it was more of like this is not good for you. It's not good for us. Like, you can't do this. And I know that you know how to work this because we both work the same program, and I know that you worked it. So I know that you're familiar with this. And so the thing, like, when you fully surrender your sobriety, now I'm going to speak for addicts, and I deal with some codependency, but I would classify myself as an addict. A good litmus test to see if to kind of like, if you're having doubts about whether you're surrendered to the process is, does anybody else's opinion about my sobriety affect my sobriety? And if it does, then you should look at it. You should really take the time to look at it, because not everybody's going to be stoked with your success. And that wasn't you. There were at no point did I feel like you were not happy with my success, but you were having a hard time with it. And I recognized, again, it was a lesson for me in kind of dealing with my own version of my own special version of my codependency. It's all codependency, but my codependency looks a little bit different than yours. That, like,
Personalized codependency.
I can't, in the same way she couldn't fix me, I can't fix her in this. And so I remember the moment that like, really finally, I'm like, you can't, like, we got to figure this out. Is when like, I didn't have my phone that day, and you didn't know where I was, and you were freaking out, and there was like all of this insecurity and all of these things that were like coming at, like, I walked in the door and you just were like right there, like in my face, not really in my face, but like you were very upset with me. And I'm just like, the only thing I'm guilty of is not having my phone right now. Like, I don't know what I did. And I'm like, I recognize that, like, this is not a rational thing. Like, this is not, there's something else going on. And so I didn't fight you on it. I'm like, I'm not, like, I can't fight her on this. Like, what's going on? And that's when I think, which is not me. I'm like, I have no problem fighting if I feel like I'm right about something. But through recovery, I've learned that you can be right or you can be happy. And another way to say that is, like, you can be right or you can be useful. And I could have argued with you and been like, "You're being crazy. You're being like, no, I'm not dealing with you on this." But I think there have been moments in our marriage since I've been sober, as God's continued to work on me, where we've had some genuinely, like, amicable, cooperative moments of working on our marriage together that I think it surprises both of us.
Yeah, I think too.
Like, we have those moments and we're like, did we just adult, like, in a healthy way?
Well, yeah, and it because it's surprising. But I think too, what I'm realizing is, so in order to have a healthy marriage with an addict, you have to detach with love. And I really want somebody to teach on reattaching in love.
Right.
Because it's hard. I mean, I love him and I always loved him through any of it. Um, but detaching in love meant that I had to stop investing in that part of his life. I had to remove myself from that to protect myself from a distance, or love him from a distance and protect myself and protect my kids. And so then when you got sober, it's like I had to learn how to reattach. Like, what does that look like? Because detaching in love is very powerful. It's very powerful. It's very protective, and it's very,
It's necessary,
yeah, it is. It is. It's
but
100% necessary.
it's not meant to be where you stay forever.
Correct.
Hopefully. And so, like I think, kind of a broader thing that's been going on in my life is recovery is always going to be a vital part of my life, but it's not every part of my life. And so I think there are certain aspects of this that, like, while you could teach about it on recovery, this kind of goes beyond it a little bit. Like, this is also there's certain aspects of reattaching, like kind of rebuilding that trust and doing those things that you do in recovery. But there are things that are just normal life, marriage work kind of things. There are spiritual things, I think. And it's going to look so different for everybody. Like I remember asking Carol when she had her episode about, like, when Randy, because she got sober and it took Randy a while. And when he finally got sober, like, what was that like for you? And she didn't have the same experience
No,
that
she's
you
like,
had.
I was so happy. And I was like, I was pissed.
Yeah. And so it's going to look different for everybody.
Right.
And if you're, like, again, like, this kind of goes to what I said about the grieving process. It's kind of a tough tension in recovery because a lot of us come in here without knowing how to handle emotion. And so we learn through recovery that, like, emotions are not truth. They are indicators, they are motivators, they are things that are meant to indicate that something is wrong or something might be right, but it doesn't mean that they're always right.
Feelings
Like,
are factual.
yes, you need to take what you're feeling and kind of run it through the filter of what you know to be true. And if things don't align, you know that there's something that you need to reassess. I forgot. My mind just went blank. Oh my gosh. Man, I just had, drugs are bad, kids. Like, don't do them, or you'll end up having moments like I'm having right now. Not that I'm on drugs, just the damage was done probably. Like, if you're having, I know. Okay, I'm back. I'm back, guys. I remembered it. But if you're having feelings of, like, you went through, where I'm sure it was conflicting for you because, like, I should be happy that he's sober, but I'm still, like, there's still things that I'm struggling with.
Mm-hmm.
There's still resentments maybe that I'm struggling with, or why is this so difficult for me to reassimilate into our marriage in a healthy way? Or really, honestly, in our case, learning to be married in a healthy way for the first time, because I pretty much, like, I, like, trapped you, and then I'm like, now it's time to show you my crazy, and then, here we are, 7.5 years worth of that or whatever. Don't deny yourself the struggle. Like, don't deny yourself admitting that you're struggling with something.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is one thing that you should never take. Like, if you're feeling guilty, or especially with feelings like guilt and shame, as much as those feelings want to make you not talk about it with other people, because especially with shame, like, if you're feeling ashamed that I feel this way, that is the exact time that you should be talking with somebody about it, because shame is never.
Shame as I am, guilt as I did.
Yeah.
Right.
Like,
so claiming that as what you are. I think for me, when that happened, it's, there was a lot of confusion, and a lot of fear, of really having to open up again, and letting you into that. And then it was very frustrating because it's like, you prayed for this. Why are you not rejoicing in this? And it was the unknown. What is this like? What does life look like with both of us sober? Like, with both of us working a program, what is that? And I didn't, and then the codependent nature of, like, you don't want to tell him, you don't want to say anything because you don't want to rock the boat, right? Like, you don't want to, like, and that is exactly
which caused
where,
its own issues because you do not hide things well at all.
right.
And so I knew something was wrong. And so,
Because it's a struggle of like, I should not feel this way.
right. And
Sorry.
and what's amazing is that, like, the not rock the boat comment is that I
The boat was already rocking.
well, here's the thing, like, sometimes we assume that things will offend somebody or hurt somebody if we say them. But like that if you would have been honest with me about it, not that you were lying, but if you had just told me, I would have understood.
Mm-hmm.
And but I also understand that, like, that's a process for you, like,
What I think too,
and
it
so
was
I'm not even necessarily faulting you for it. I'm just saying, like,
but it was hard to even wrap my mind around what it was.
right, right,
It was just feelings
sense,
of, I couldn't figure it out.
right,
Like, what was driving this? What is actually bothering me? Like, because I know that if I talk to you about it, then it'll be okay. But it's trying to figure out what is going on. I could not articulate what the issue was.
right. I could see that, and part of the reason why I understood why the reason why I wanted to do this as its kind of second part of a two-part thing is that I knew that this needed to be talked about in depth because you don't really hear a lot about this subject.
No,
And
it's sober, and then life is all rainbows and
because
butterflies.
I
And
think part of that, the reason why we don't talk about recovery is, like I said, it kind of goes beyond. It's not, while it is to do with recovery, it's not just recovery related, right? Like, not everything kind of, like, there are things beyond just recovery, and like, I think there are components of that. Like, this is a marriage thing as well. Like, this was one part of dealing with the reality of me being sober, and so that is recovery related, but dealing with our marriage and actually having a healthy marriage for the first time and working towards that is a marriage thing. Like, that is something that is kind of also its own thing as well. And but I definitely do think in recovery, like, it's important to at least talk about the struggle of it. Like, you could have this struggle. Like, this is something that you might deal with.
mhm.
And it's kind of a unique situation, right? Like, not everybody goes through this, but there are a lot of people who do. And
Well, I think though too, it goes outside of just marriage. I mean, anybody in a codependent relationship, when somebody gets sober, like they go through this stuff. It's not. I mean, yeah, it's different because it's instant. Like it's a daily thing where we are together every day, and I can't, distance myself to process. Like I have to, but reattaching to someone or rejoining that person, um, that goes in any type of relationship where there's trauma.
mhm, yeah. So let's wrap up the episode this way. And let's say you're sitting across from somebody right now and they're in a similar situation. You're loving somebody, you've loved somebody in addiction, and now they're entering sobriety, and things are changing. As you sit across from that person, what advice do you have for them? And then I'll do the same from the addict's perspective.
Push into your recovery. This is when you need recovery more than you've ever needed it. You need your support system. You need to process. This is a time to be selfish. You know, understand. I think awareness would have been wonderful for me to know. Like this could happen. Like
Mhm.
this is something very real. Of like you've detached and you've, especially when it's been healthy. Like when you've done marriage with an addict in a healthy manner, if that makes sense. Like when you have detached with love and you've you still want what's best for that person. Like there's still the desire there, right?
Mhm.
Like it's okay when they get sober to be like to have confusion. Um but in that confusion, it's important to work your program. It's important to talk about it. Talk to your sponsor first about it. Like, this is what I'm feeling. How can I say this? I mean, there were times in addiction where I would call her and be like, this is what I want to say to him. Blah, 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 blah. And she'd be like, okay, well, let's not say that. And let's say this, because this is what you really mean. Because in that situation, I didn't know what I really meant. Like, I could not identify anything. So if someone is in that situation, take the time to invest in yourself and process what's going on and really think about, like, okay, what is the motivating factor for this? Like, why, what is going on? Acknowledging that this is big change. I mean, this is a life change. And anytime change happens, your body responds to it, your mind responds to it in different ways. And so, really just like reach out, be honest with the person that's sober of, I'm struggling with this. I'm so happy for you, but I am struggling. And pray before you go into that conversation, because it's terrifying to go up to somebody who's sober and saying, like, because it's so contradictory of, like, it literally is a tug of war within your heart of, like, I'm so happy, but I'm struggling, and, like, I can't figure out why I'm struggling or what I'm struggling about. But I am. So I think that, like I said earlier, pushing into a program and really working on yourself and understanding or getting to the root of the feelings that you're feeling. And then just awareness that it could happen. You, as excited as you are, and I don't ever want you to think, Matt, that I was not excited for you. Like, there was never a moment where I was not relieved and ecstatic that you finally accepted who you are. And when you surrendered to the Lord, like, that never was not there. I was always excited for you. But then there is that selfish nature where it's change, and it's hard, and it's confusion. We're Celebrate Recovery, so my higher power is Jesus, and there's nothing the enemy wants more than to destroy a marriage. And I truly believe that is his last chance of destroying something. Who, when you've stayed with somebody for so long in marriage, of like, okay, now he's sober, I'm going to go and take her, and then I'm going to divide and conquer. So knowing too that there's a spiritual aspect of that, of spiritual attack.
For the addict who's sober, who's gotten sober and who might be struggling with this, I like to visualize things. So imagine this. Imagine you have the power to create a tornado. And you create that tornado and you keep creating it, and you ignore all of the devastation that it could cause until eventually it just gets out of your control. And it sucks you into it, and everybody you care about are in its path, and there's destruction and there's mayhem. And then imagine that one day the storm clears, and it's perfect blue crystal skies, it's a beautiful day. The relief that you would feel in that moment of, like, the storm's finally over, and how beautiful those clear skies would look to you. And then you look back, and this devastation that the tornado that you created has caused, it's still there. Yes, there's relief that you were no longer sucked into that mayhem anymore, and you found a way out. And that is absolutely the first step to dealing with the carnage, is that the thing that's causing the carnage has to stop. But just know, as you are moving forward with your life finally, and you're finally finding freedom and finally figuring out who you are, and God's working on those character defects, that other people are in different places than you. And while you might be moving on, they might not be ready to. And in the same way that you cannot control how they process it, you do have an obligation to do what you can to make it right. And what oftentimes that looks like is to be patient and to understand that when somebody else is struggling with the carnage that you created, you don't get to dictate to them the pace in which they work it. And so your responsibility in that is to be patient and to be understanding, because they were patient in many ways and understanding with you. And they chose to remain in your life when they could have left. Doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you're indebted to them. It means that you can't force them to move at your pace. And I would say that it requires the conscious decision to not take things personally. And it's not something that I always did in this process, partially because I didn't know what was going on. There was no podcast about this topic that I ever listened to before this process started. But if you're listening to this and you're in that situation, you no longer have the luxury of ignorance. I'm telling you from experience, and I think that other people will agree, that there's going to be some of this most likely, especially if you're married. And guess what? Doesn't mean it's fun to deal with. It doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean it's not frustrating, but it just is. And that's okay. That is okay. It is a part of the process. And I promise you that, especially if you are both working recovery, it's going to be fine. You're going to get through it. And what you're going to find is that you have something even more beautiful than you could have imagined on the other side of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it wasn't you that got you sober. You made the choice to do the things you had to do, but it wasn't by your power. It was through a higher power. And that same higher power can usher you in to a healthy marriage, maybe for the first time that you've ever experienced. And that's worth it. The patience is worth it. The understanding is worth it. And the amends are worth it.
And the people are worth it.
That's right. So, thank you guys for listening. I hope you got something out of it. Please go check out the other episodes. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. If you haven't listened to the first part of Natalie's episode, I would definitely recommend you do that. And yeah, there's going to be more to come, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, guys.